the presentation I'm going to make will stimulate some thoughts. It may not be so close to hydrodynamic stability. However, some stability issues will be addressed. And yeah, let's go. I first want to point out contributions of my co-workers, and I want to mention Ernst Hoffmann, Frank Muldoon, Roman Mukin, Francesco Romano, Hao-Tsian Wu, and Ilya Barmak. They have, well, a great share on this presentation. Now, here's the outline. That's practically the program that I planned. So first, of course, I want to give you some motivation. And then one important aspect is where do fluid elements go? Because we want to consider particles which are almost density matched to the flow. So they are almost tracers. And the first question then would be natural, where do fluid elements go? Where do perfect tracers go? And then we consider what inertia does. Then we have, and that's the new thing, the role of the boundary. And then we consider some examples, different systems where we find attractors for the particle motion. Okay, here the motivation comes from thermocapillary flow in liquid bridges. That's a technical process to grow single crystals where you have a cylindrical system, you have a liquid drop because you are heating locally, and then you move that liquid zone through the material to have melting and solidifying interfaces by which way you can create a single crystal. And to understand the flow in this liquid, people have thought of a simplifying model of a liquid bridge that consists of two solid rods which are kept at different temperatures. For instance, here the upper rod typically is kept at a hot temperature, the lower rod at a cold temperature. And then if you have this temperature difference, there is a temperature variation along the interface between the ambient gas and the liquid. And this leads to thermocapillary surface stresses. So it's a thermocapillary effect. So there are viscous stresses then acting due to the variation of the surface tension, which drives the flow from the hot end to the cold end, and naturally a return flow here, so that you, in case of complete symmetry, have a toroidal vortex. And this toroidal vortex can become unstable. And people wanted to visualize this flow by putting some tracers in there. Here you have the upper rod, which is hot, and there's the lower rod, which is cold. And in this movie, I want to show you how that liquid bridge is created, set up, and the heating starts. And have a look what's happening. Here on the right-hand side, you have an axial view into the liquid because the upper heater is transparent. And this diamond-shaped bright zone, that's due to the illumination. So it's just an illumination artifact. So try to ignore this type of zone. So now the liquid is generated, you see from the side and from the top. First, we have an axisymmetric flow, and then very rapidly some instability arises and the flow becomes three-dimensional. And the tracers, which should follow the flow perfectly, are observed to segregate and form this like three-star pattern, which is rotating. And that's the curious phenomenon. Which was, I think 20 years ago, nobody understood that. And here's another movie where we look axial through that. You can, just to show that it's robust and occurs on a rapid time scale, you can perturb this pattern, and then it is recreated, that's real time here, in this liquid bridge. Once again, I have to say that this liquid bridge has a radius of 2.5 millimeters. So it's a millimetric system and the particles are of micron size. So the question is, because the particles are very small and supposed to follow the flow perfectly. So the first question we want to address is, where do fluid elements go? Because that's where also perfect tracers would go. Now look at this first, the basic state. We in an incompressible flow. So that's an important aspect. Our flow is incompressible. Then we would have to solve the advection equation to determine the position capital X in a flow field U. And we know, well, in 2D flow, that can be obtained through the stream function psi. And the form of this equation shows that psi is a Hamiltonian of a dynamical system of 1 degree of freedom. So if you go now to 3D, three-dimensional, this post-critical state and the flow, you have a three-dimensional steady flow. I mean, we have seen the flow was not steady, but it arises in a wave form, an azimuthally traveling wave. And if you transform, if you imagine you follow this wave in the rotating frame of reference, then this flow becomes steady. So we can confine our consideration to incompressible, steady 3D flows. And then one can show, that's done by Bayer, that also, except from singular points in time, you can construct a Hamiltonian system which would correspond to 1.5 degrees of freedom. And it's known from a conservative system in phase space, then there exist regular and chaotic trajectories in phase space in general. But here in our flow, the phase space is made by the real space, and we have regular and chaotic streamlines in that steady flow. And to find that, usually you have to integrate the three-dimensional flow numerically. And there are a lot of errors associated with this usually. So it's easier to, if you have the flow field in a closed form. So we designed a closed form expression for U, and the flow occurs in a cylinder, mimicking the flow in that liquid bridge. And it's constructed such that you have a streamline crowding near the free surface, near the circular cylindrical surface. The point is, you can construct it in closed form such that the flow field is exactly incompressible, but unfortunately, because it's designed, it's not a solution of the Navier-Stokes equation, but it looks very similar. And here's the flow field. These are the radial, azimuthal, and axial velocity components. You have a basic flow, which has no azimuthal component, and the basic flow looks like this. Here is the free surface, and here is the axis. So that's the radial and the vertical coordinate. So you have that axisymmetric basic flow, if you wish so. It mimics the basic flow. Here it's symmetric with respect to the midplane. That's not true in the experiment, but well, the essential features are realized. And then you have to add the three-dimensional part corresponding to the wave we have seen. And this wave, it's called a hydrothermal wave because the temperature plays a role for the instability process. However, here we only need the velocity field. And the wave, the essential features of the wave are that you have more or less axial vortices. So you don't have an axial velocity component here in the model, although in reality you have, but in the model, no. And then an axial view, we have here, let's say, 6 counter-rotating vortices, which would rotate. And we want to consider this in the frame in which the flow is steady. So if you're in your physical system, if you go to the rotating frame, then you would see an azimuthal solid body rotational flow just to the frame rotation, and you have to add that as well. And then you can select any initial condition somewhere, and integrate your this advection equation to find the trajectory of a fluid element. And if you do that for enough fluid elements, you find these structures. And what's shown here is structures. These are tori. These are the so-called Kolmogorov-Arnold-Moser tori, KAM in short, KM tori. And imagine you place an initial condition here on this blue torus. Then the fluid element would go along that torus. It's a closed torus, and would also wind on the torus, and it would always move on the surface of a torus. And same for the orange one. And this is regular motion. It's kind of a quasi-periodic motion of that fluid element. And the empty space that you see here, which is not colored, that's essentially filled by chaotic streamlines. So if you start, for instance, here in the white area region here, the fluid element can go inside, and it can go between the tori, and so on. So how do the tori look inside? And for that, you can make consider a plane at a constant azimuthal angle. Let's say here near this green torus, and then you make a cut, and you make a Poincaré section. That means whenever the trajectory of that fluid element crosses this plane at a constant phi, you place a dot. And here you see many gray dots. These are dots of a chaotic trajectory. If you integrate for all, I think it's several chaotic trajectories. If you integrate for long enough, you will return to this plane often, but your Poincaré points are randomly scattered. However, if you initialize a trajectory in one of the regular regions, the points will all lie on a closed curve, and that closed curve is the cross-section of that KM torus. And you see the KM tori, they are densely nested, and well, apparently there's a boundary, but if you would zoom in, I think you find self-similarity and so on. The boundary is not very sharp defined, but on this scale, it appears to be sharply defined. And the important thing also is that in the center, you have a KM torus where the radius or the diameter of that torus shrinks to 0, and that's a closed streamline. So in all of these objects here, the KM tori, in the center, you have a closed streamline here and there and there and there. And here's another one. You cannot see it. This green torus is rather stretched along the free surface. And that's a property because you have a high streamline crowding here. So you have large axial stresses acting on the flow, I would say here, because it's not a real flow, but it's similar to the real flow. So inside the KM tori, you have a quasi-periodic motion on a torus. Outside of the Kolmogorov-Arnold-Moser tori, you have chaotic motion of fluid elements. And if the particle would be a perfect tracer, it would also be chaotic and would be quasi-periodic. But our system is conservative in incompressible flow in phase space, so there are no attractors within this. So to have particle attractors, the particle motion must deviate from the fluid motion, and that can happen through the inertia effect. So now we look into particle motion, and we assume that the system size is h, which just gives us the outer length scale, and the particle, usually it's small, the particle radius is AP. Here we consider the relative particle radius, which is the A. It's just a scaled radius. And then an important parameter is the density ratio between the particle and the fluid. So we call this by this row. That's a slightly different row than the original rows. So if the density differs, rho deviates from 1, and then the velocity of the particle will in general not be identical with the velocity of the flow. And for the motion of these particles, the Stokes number is very important, essentially up, except from the density ratio here, the common factor 2/9. It's the Stokes number is the ratio of the relaxation time of the particle, which I call tau p, and the characteristic time of the flow. Now, for the relaxation time of the particle, you can put the viscous time scale made with the particle radius, for instance, and for the time of the flow, you can assume the convective time scale if u is a characteristic velocity of the flow. So that's the convective time scale. And then this h, u, and nu, you can combine this into a Reynolds number here. And what remains is just the factor a squared. So the scaled particle radius squared. If you would use the viscous time scale for the flow, you would have here h squared over nu, and then this Reynolds number would be 1. And that's what we mostly do. So we define our Stokes number just as the square, more or less, of the normalized particle radius. That's our Stokes number, and we define it without the rho. So that's a slightly different definition. So the Stokes number is just a squared measure of the particle size. Now, if the particle time tends to 0, corresponding to a 0 Stokes number, you can achieve that by letting the particle radius going to 0. So we have a point particle, and that indicates a perfect tracer. And that limit, the particle would exactly move like the flow. So we consider small Stokes number, and if the Stokes number, this is the full Stokes number, Stokes tilde, let this be small compared to 1. Let the Reynolds number for the motion of the particle relative to the flow also be small, and let the particle move far away from boundaries. And under these conditions, you can use the famous Maxey-Riley equation for the motion of a particle. That's a so-called one-way approach. That means the particle motion is affected by the fluid motion. However, the presence of the particle does not change the fluid flow. So the advantage is you can compute your flow before you do anything, and then you can move your particle in that flow. You don't have to couple both tightly. That's in this limit of small Stokes mass, small particle Reynolds number, and far away from the boundary. And the original Maxey-Riley equation can be also a little bit simplified. And here we use the MR, that's the Maxey-Riley equation in this form. That's presented by Babbiano in 2000. Essentially, it gives you the acceleration of the particle in terms of a drag force. That's the famous Stokes drag, based on the difference of the velocities of the particle and the fluid flow. Then you have, when they move differently, then you have a drag force. And here is a pressure force, essentially due to the that can be calculated beforehand. For instance, in our stationary three-dimensional flow, it would just be the convective derivative, namely u nabla u would enter here, giving you the pressure force on the particle. So now if you look at this Maxey-Riley equation and consider the limit of 0 Stokes number, then this term dominates. So you can forget about this term and that term. And so x dot minus u must be 0, and you end up with the perfect advection equation. Now, we want to use this equation to compute the particle motion. And in our model, we have to solve that equation because we want to have that steady flow in the rotating frame. So we need to have that Maxey-Riley equation in the rotating frame. And here it is. In the rotating frame is indicated by the prime. So in particular, essentially, this is form invariant in the rotating frame. However, you have additionally Coriolis force and centrifugal force, which you can derive in as these expressions. It's not so important. I just want to mention that. So you don't have to recall this equation. So now what happens if we initialize a particle? We have a small Stokes number. The Stokes number is larger than 0. So that changes our conservative system to a dissipative system. And then we can have, of course, fixed point limit cycles and all these dissipative structures. Now we have a very small Stokes number, 10 to the power of -4, and initialize a particle somewhere. And then we consider once again this Poincare plane at this angle. Well, the density ratio is set to 2 because you need a non-zero tilde Stokes number. And what you find in this Poincare plane, the intersection points are here, there, and you see that whenever the particle returns to that plane, it ultimately would spiral into a fixed point in the Poincare plane. But it's only a plane. That's just the intersection of a limit cycle with this Poincare plane. And that limit cycle is very close to the closed streamline L33. Well, the closed streamline L33, let me go back. Oops. It's just this point. It's due to the construction of flow field at z equals 0 here. So it's very close to this point, but it's not exactly in that point. So you can measure, for instance, the distance between the successive Poincare points, take the distance, and you find that you can approximate the distance with such an exponential function. There are some oscillations due to the discrete nature, I think, of that spiral here. But essentially, the red line indicates that's an exponential shrinking of the distance and also an exponential approach to the limit cycle. So you can actually determine from the slope a sigma. That's the attraction rate to the limit cycle. Now, if you plot the attraction rate to the limit cycle, consider first the black dots here. The black dots are for the constant Stokes number. And now if you vary the particle density, you find that for density matching, of course, the attraction rate is 0, but the larger the density ratio deviates from 1, the stronger the attraction is. So that's the stronger the attraction is. So it's a linear law that we find. And also if, for instance, you keep, for the red dots, you keep the density ratio constant and vary the Stokes number, vary the particle size practically, you also find a linear variation in this model. So this linear variation also appears in what's called the inertial equation. That's yet a further simplification of the Maxey-Riley equation, expanded for a small Stokes number, or in lowest order of the Stokes number, or in a squared. This is the inertial equation here. And the order of the differential equation is reduced by 1, so it's only first order. So the velocity of the particle is given in terms of u, but then there is a correction factor. And this correction factor, there is this factor rho minus 1 times the Stokes number. So that's the a squared practically. And one finds that this practically gives you the scaling of the attraction rate. So for density, either density matching or for 0 particle size, the attraction rate to the limit cycle would go to 0. So that's, and here we have the convective derivative. That's a buoyancy term. I don't discuss this any further here. Here is, that's an interesting Poincare section. In this plane, I only show the outlines here in orange or in blue of the major KM structures, or the core, that's the big KM structure here. And here is the closed streamline. There's another closed streamline here. So I consider here, let's say, Stokes 10 to the power of -4, and a heavy particle, and a slightly heavy particle. It would be attracted, for instance, to this point. This point we have just seen before, how it spirals in there. Now, if I increase the density ratio, then the limit cycle will be found here, 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 and these points indicate the location of the limit cycles if you increase the density ratio. So you have an increasing inertial effect here, and you find the same here. This is for heavy particles, but what about for light particles? Or do we always find a stable limit cycle? No. For instance, if we initialize our particle here, a heavy particle, put it in the core of that vortex here, it would not be attracted to a limit cycle. This closed streamline would convert into a repelling limit cycle. So the stability of that limit cycle is crucial. Here, these limit cycles are stable, but this limit cycle, which grows out of the core, is unstable. So the Poincaré points would scatter all around. The same happens for this green KM torus. So there is no stable limit cycle for heavy particles evolving from that green closed streamline, which would sit here. However, if you put lighter particles, then they are attracted to this center. And we know that if you have a vortex, and we know that light particles are attracted to the center of the vortex, whereas heavy particles are centrifuged out of the vortex. But in the general case of KM tori, it's very hard to predict whether the limit cycle that is created by the inertia effect is stable or not. Well, you can put it also in terms of stability, that the limit cycles which exist in the conservative systems and which grow out of the closed streamline L are created by a small perturbation of the governing equation, and that's a structural instability of the governing, structural instability of the structures that are exhibited by this equation. So the stability of the emerging limit cycle depends on the sign of rho -1 and on the particular KM torus. So in general, you cannot always predict whether the limit cycle would be stable or not. Now, how do they look, the limit cycles? How do they look like? Well, here you can see in red, for instance, in that model flow, in the rotating frame of reference, the limit cycle is, well, the red curve. For other density ratios, they look similar. They just somehow phase shifted and a little bit deformed. And you may compare that with the particle structure that you observe experimentally. And here, this is not a limit cycle, but okay, there are many particles which cluster along that line, or, well, actually they don't move along the line, but the structure is rotating, and in the rotating frame of reference, the particle would go along the line, but not in the laboratory frame. So here it's made of many, many small particles, which apparently don't interact very much, because otherwise they would be much more dispersed. So the attraction to that limit cycle could be interpreted as that's a single particle effect. But apparently you may think, well, here we have also many single particle effects, attractions to a certain structure. It looks very similar, but hey, wait a minute. Is that really true? Can we make this assumption? Well, the limit cycle comes very close to the free surface, to the boundary. And remember the Maxwell-Riley equation. requires to be far away from the boundary, and maybe the approximation made will break down in this point. And if you look at that structure, the structure also comes very close to the free surface. Actually, it seems to touch the free surface. So here in this region, something else is likely to happen. So there should be a boundary effect. So, well, even though it's suggested to assume that's an inertial effect, actually it is not, as I will show also later. And there is a disturbing measurement in this regard done by Schwabe in 2007. And he, as we have seen in the initial movie, is perturbing the pattern that the particles form. And then after perturbing it, he is measuring the time until he can see that pattern again. And he calls that the formation time, which is given here in seconds. So how long does it take from a perturbed state to for the particles to reach the attractor? And he does experiments for particles with 6 to 8 microns, so approximately the same radius for all the particles shown here, only he changed the density. So the density ratio here. Here we have heavy particles, and you see as the heavy particles approach the neutrally buoyant situation, rho equals 1, then the formation time is shorter. So it's actually density matching seems to be optimum to have that particle, the particles to be attracted. However, that's in contradiction with the inertial process, because for density matching, we don't have any attraction, so it would typically take forever for a particle to be attracted. Here it's just the other way around. That's a complete contradiction. And moreover, he finds that the size is important. There exists an optimum size for this process. And this is an indication here. This minimum of the formation time is an indication that size is important and inertia of the particle is not important. So let's go for the size effect, or let's go for what we call particle boundary interaction. And this Ernst Hoffmann and Roman Mukin mainly have contributed to this. Now it's easiest to explain this in 2D. So actually, because the situation, such a collision process is very complicated and also computationally intensive, because you have to deal with many different length and time scales. However, we assume a very simplified model by which we hope to capture the essence of this process. Now assume you have a finite size particle here moving in 2D in a steady flow on that streamline, and there are other streamlines, of course, here, and it comes close to the boundary here, which is indicated by the red line. Now, if the particle has a finite size, its centroid moving on a streamline, its centroid may not come close to that boundary, because it would collide here, and so it's not possible. And even for liquid bridges, the interface is almost indeformable on the scale of the particle. So moreover, there will be also a lubrication film, or film between the particle radius and the surface of the particle and the boundary, and this is the lubrication film thickness. And well, not necessarily lubrication, this delta could be easily of the same order of magnitude as A. So the compound quantity is capital delta. And we say, well, the centroid of the particle cannot enter that layer of thickness capital delta on the boundary, which is rapidly moving here in our case. So now what's happening when the particle moves there at latest, when the centroid arrives here in this point, it cannot follow that streamline anymore. So the simplest thing that you can imagine, it's transported by the other velocity components tangential to that layer here of thickness delta until the particle centroid finds a position where it can detach from the interface and be transported into the bulk. So it would go here, but it cannot because it goes through this prohibited region. So you have a collision, a sliding phase, and here's a release point where the centroid of the particle finds a streamline along which it can detach from the interface. So it ends up here. And actually, that's kind of a streamline hopping effect from one streamline to another streamline. And the result of this in 2D is that all the particles which are initialized here in this wide region with their centroid, they would eventually collide and be transferred to that streamline. So the wide region would be depleted of particles, and this torus, or this, no, it's a closed curve in 2D, or if you extend it in 3D, it's a torus, of course, would be enriched with particles. And furthermore, if the particles have a higher density, and if you have some centrifugal effects, they would also be removed from there. So you have a toroidal structure on which all the particles move. So, and actually you can see that in axisymmetric flow in a thermocapillary liquid bridge. If you look axially, that's a long time exposure. Now let's have a movie here. And if you consider the movie, there is an asymmetry due to the experimental imperfection. But if you, for instance, look in the upper left region here, you see that the particles move to here, and then they stay on a torus. And you clearly also can see in the center this depletion zone. There are no particles in here, although initially you had a random distribution of particles. So that's an indication that this very crude model relates, it's an approximation to what's really going on. Now, what happens in 3D? In 3D, it's a little bit more complicated. Now, imagine you make a consider a horizontal plane through the point where the closed streamline has the closest approach to the interface or to the boundary, and make a horizontal plane here. So let's consider a cross section along that line. And then if your Km torus does not enter the prohibited region, here's the boundary, then there's no effect. You have no attractor due to the particle boundary interaction. However, if your Km torus enters, then practically these points here in the gray region, they are actually not accessible by the particles. They would be repelled and should stay outside, and they would be mapped on that boundary here, which this would be corresponding distance delta from the boundary. And then there's a repeated mapping here on that line, which ultimately maps the particles to a torus. So you have a quasi-periodic motion. And as soon as the closed streamline enters the prohibited region, so the prohibited region increases to the right, so we assume the particle size increases, then this quasi-periodic attractor shrinks to 0 to a line, and that's the limiting the tangent case. And from that on, you have a line attractor, and then, well, you can think how that mapping would go on. So it's a little bit more complicated, and I think I don't have the time to go into so much detail here. So it just, if you want to know more about it, look into this paper, and yeah, I skipped this. Now, I come to some results of this process, and we have, if that's really due to this particle boundary collision, we call the resulting structure finite size coherent structure in a liquid bridge. It's mainly due to Francesco Romano here. we consider a liquid bridge, so a cylindrical volume. We have a high Prandtl number fluid. The parameters are not of very much interest, but for certain parameters, we just find a single Km torus here, and it's very slender. It's complicated, looks complicated shape. It's very thin, very peculiar. It's not so easy to find it, but there's this structure in the flow. So it's just a pure flow structure. Now, if you do an experiment, you find actually structures where the particles cluster, and that structure is rotating, which corresponds to that Km torus. In the center, you have sedimented particles. Okay, the experiment is under buoyancy, and the buoyancy is also taken care of in the in the numerical calculation of that structure here. And then you can try to make a simulation with. And we did 1,000 particles, which are initially randomly distributed in that volume. They are, of course, non-interacting. It's just a means to get some statistics. So it's a one single particle effect here. And we see after a while, after a sufficient while, that the particles cluster, in fact, on that Km torus, which is indicated here by the black line. And the particles sit there. There are some other particles which need more longer time, probably, to be attracted. However, also in our simulation, we use this collision model, and we have to add to the particle radius our lubrication gap, which is like 50% of the particles. So it's substantial. And we use this delta to obtain that structure, whereas the particle radius is 0.003 roughly. We use 0.004 for the delta. And then we can confirm this, this attractor. Now, an interesting aspect is, if you don't use the Maxey-Riley equation to move the particles in the bio, but use just advection, so that means you have here perfect tracers and the same delta, then you find practically the same effect. That means the inertia is not important for this structure to appear. It's just due to the boundary collision, because the structure comes very close to the interface. Furthermore, if you take into account inertia using the Maxey-Riley equation, however, don't take into account the lubrication gap. That means selecting the wrong particle size with inertia, there is no limit cycle. That indicates the particle size must be selected corresponding to the distance of the Km structure to the boundary. And inertia is not important. Actually, also the Stokes number here is 10 to the power of -6. Okay, and this structure is in reality the particles which cluster here. It's made of many particles which apparently don't interact very much. Or in other words, in our model, the interaction is not taken into account, but that's an open question about the interaction. So next, consider another example, because in the thermocapillary liquid bridge, it's thermal, it's small scale, so and the viscosity varies, so it's very difficult to control. We wanted to have a system which is better to control and which is larger. However, with the larger system, the inertia effect, because it scales with the square of the particle size, becomes more prominent. In order to eliminate the inertia effect, you have to density match the particles very well. So, and the results here are mainly due to the experiments by Haotian Wu. Here's the system, and I return here also a little bit to stability that we are considering. It's in an experiment, we have two rotating cylinders, which are rotating, co-rotating, such that the space between the rotating cylinders here, the surfaces are in gray, The space is, there's made a cavity between the rotating cylinders, a top lid which is transparent and a bottom lid, and it's largely extended in the Z direction. So I only show here one of a periodic cell, a unit cell, which is relevant for our experiments. And here's the coordinate system. So we have a cavity, left wall moving up, other wall moving down, which drives a strained vortex in that cavity. And later on, we shall consider the Poincaré plane in blue here. That's the plane y equals 0. Now, if you look at that cavity from the top and drive that system into the stability where the transition from 2D to 3D flow occurs, then you find steady convection cells. They are shown here. And here's a movie. I don't know if you can see this through the internet. In any case, the peculiar situation is that this pattern arises due to the elliptic instability. And it's a stationary pattern. It's very robust. And it has symmetries. So you have, do you want to say something? No? It has symmetries. The flow is point symmetric with respect to the cell center here, and the cells are mirror symmetric to their boundaries. So the cells are practically rectangular, except from that small curvature of the driving walls, which are here in this picture on the upper and the lower boundary. Now, where are we regarding the stability of the two-dimensional flow, which is driven by two facing walls moving in opposite direction? Then you have here the distance of the walls to the height of the cavity. That's the aspect ratio. And Stefan Albensoeder here has carried out the linear stability analysis numerically. You find the colored curves, different modes which arise, and the blue curves, these are all elliptic instabilities. And elliptic instabilities, they occur due to strain in the center of the vortex. So if the vortex is not in solid body rotation, you always have strain. And if the strain becomes strong, you get a 3D instability. And the movie I've shown, or the cells, they are here. So even far from that stability boundary, there's a complicated region here, you still have a steady cells. So the elliptic instability leads to steady cells. Now, our experiments that we carry out are located here at Reynolds number 400. That choice has been made because we wanted to have the corresponding Km structures in that flow. And for Reynolds number 400 and this aspect ratio, the unit cell of the three-dimensional flow, which you obtain by numerical simulation, exhibits, well, these Km tori. So they are also high periodicity Km tori. And in the horizontal cross-section at y equals 0, you find, well, one system here, and then the point symmetrically located system over there. The pluses, closed streamline of the major red Km torus, which is surrounded here by the blue period 5 torus and also another higher periodicity Psion torus. Here the same, they are point symmetric. Now let's put a particle in this cavity, run at high Reynolds number to randomize the initial condition because we want to check whether the results are repeatable. Then we ramp down to the targeted Reynolds number, defining the initial time. Then we measure the trajectory because we have access by through two cameras through the transparent upper lid. And then we can measure the trajectory. We need a very good density matching. So our density ratio is 1.0001. You can achieve that only to control the density of the liquid by the temperature. So the experiment is temperature controlled to regulate the fluid density to achieve that density ratio close practically to B1. So that's neutrally buoyant, more or less, that particle. And if you do long exposures, do different experimental runs, a long exposure, you see that there's a limit cycle for the particle. The dot indicates the size of the particle. There's a limit cycle here. If you repeat it, there's a limit cycle there. There's another limit cycle. You have different, the particle can settle in whatever cell. The cells are separated here by the dashed line. We see some aluminum flakes, which give you an idea where the cells are. These trajectories, however, the different attractors can be mapped to a single attractor by the symmetry operation. For instance, these two here, they are mirror symmetric with respect to the cell boundary. And this one is mirror symmetric to that boundary. So you can map them into a single cell. And here you have actually 62 repeated experiments, 62 trajectories with a particle with 2.4 millimeters of radius. And the centroid moves on that blue curve. In red, for comparison, we have the closest streamline. So it's once again an attraction close to the streamline, and it's practically density matching. So that's an effect which comes to the collision of the particle with the moving wall, either this one or that one. We also find experimentally, yes?
Sorry to interrupt. So maybe we can wrap up in 2-3 minutes and then have some questions. Is it
yes,
fine?
That's fine. We find also more complicated structures. Here, perhaps an animated Poincaré section. Initially, if you you see that the Poincaré points are scattered, and then you find they move on tori, for instance, the red ones. Now, if we start again the movie, initially random, the red ones, and not well ordered, but then they outline the quasi-periodic motion, the torus on which they move. Okay, here's well, the structures that you find varying the particle size. And well, there I could talk something about the attraction rate, but the time is over. So then I come to my conclusions. I hope I could show that we can find particle motion attractors by boundary collision effect. What is required is that the flow must be steady and exhibit Km tori. These Km tori must be close to the boundary, so the distance between the Km torus and the boundary should be of the order of the particle size, more or less. And the attraction rate can be very rapid, depends on the structure of the torus, the winding angle, I have not gone into that, on that torus, the convective time scale, and the particle size as well. And this has to be confronted with inertia effect. The inertia, for the inertia, we always find limit cycles, if they are stable, that grow out of the closed streamlines. We can't, one thing I mentioned is that you can have the situation where you have an unstable inertia-induced limit cycle, and the particles are then stabilized by the boundary effect on a torus. That can happen as well, but I could not show it. However, okay, the attraction rate is proportional to the radius squared. The boundary collision effect, they are most likely to be more important on smaller scales, because on larger scales, inertia comes in because of the particle size effect. So you have to do a very well density matching. But on smaller scales, even on millimetric scales, we have seen that micron-sized particles, they can form clusters only due to the boundary collision. So hopefully this presentation has motivated you to perhaps tackle some of the open problems that we have here. The open problem is, what about the particle-particle interaction? How does that depend, if you have many particles, how does it depend on the volume fraction of the particles, for instance? What does the Brownian motion, as your size gets smaller, Brownian motion will come in. And last not least, we have only used a simplified particle boundary mechanism by an inelastic collision. And definitely to have a better representation of that process, you need space-resolved computations of that collision process and ultimately perhaps be able to design a better model for this. So thank you very much for the attention, and I hope we have some minutes for questions.
Thank you, Hendrik, for this nice and detailed talk on various topics related to this liquid bridge and these particle structure things. So I'm sorry to stop you because of constraint of time, but now I ask the audience if they have any question directly, they can unmute and ask to Hendrik, and we have like almost 5 minutes for some discussions.
Can I just ask a question, abusing my position
Sure.
as organizer? So thank you, Professor Kuhlmann, for the very nice talk. So you showed these boundaries that are formed by the particles, right, that have this sort of threefold symmetry. There was like a paper a few years ago in PRL, I forget the authors, but it was like on experimental confirmation of Kelvin's equilibria. They did not, I think they did not have like surface tension, etc., that maybe you have. And so, but they had these experiments or in cylindrical water tanks where they were able to produce these vortices with not just the threefold symmetry, which looks very similar to what you showed, but also higher fold symmetry. So I was wondering whether you also could see something similar in your experiments, perhaps?
I don't know the publication, but maybe it's a rotating tank experiment
Yes,
where you have maybe some Kelvin waves.
So basically, yeah, it's a rotating tank experiment, and then they find these, you know, threefold and fourfold and
Yes, yeah,
boundaries.
Yeah. These are, I think that these are Kelvin waves, but yeah, they are also, I think they are inertially induced, but it's a fluid inertia. It's an inertial instability, the Kelvin waves. But here, and typically they arise on much larger length scales. So the liquid bridges, so the tank, I don't know, that's centimeters or even a meter, and the liquid bridges are small. They are on a millimetric scale. And the instability is caused by a different process. And the temperature field is very important here for these waves. Actually, the energy is produced for these so-called hydrothermal waves by the convective transport across regions of high temperature gradients. So the energy ultimately comes from the temperature field, and the flow field is actually for the high Prandtl number instability, it's more or less passive. So I would not draw any parallel between those systems.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you, Hendrik. Any further question? I mean, from any other participants? If not, maybe I will ask one question. So this, I mean, clearly it's not part of your presentation today, but I'm just curious to know if we have active particles instead of your part, like which are passive tracer. Do you have any idea what kind of structure they may like do they have a different? Do they leave your tori and form different structure, or I mean, I just was curious to know whether there is any research on that direction, or it's sort of people have tried, or you have some sort of idea what can happen in this regard.
I think I don't know of any investigation so far in this direction, but it's certainly an interesting question. What I would expect is that if you have active swimmers, depending on the activity, eventually they would lead to making such structures. If they form such structures by their size when they are transported to the interface or moving wall, and in case they are collected, then their activity, I would suspect that it would make the structure more fuzzy. So I would expect that the structure would either be destroyed completely or be diffused. It's a little bit perhaps like the expected behavior for particle-particle interaction, where you find where I expect that the structure would get more diffused because of particle-particle interaction. Another interesting aspect is also, I think, what people have seen in experiments, that you find the pulsating situation where the structure forms, then it vanishes and then reappears automatically. So it's kind of a pulsating appearance of the structure and reappearance of the structure. Also, it's a question what happens if you have particles of different sizes, for instance. These are still largely open problems.
Thank you, Hendrik, once again for this nice talk. And for the sake of time constraint, we have to move to the new speaker, next speaker.
Thank you very much.
Excuse
Thank
me,
you
sir.
once again.
Yeah.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes. Question?
Yeah.
Please.
I have a question. Yeah, Professor, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So, I mean, I don't know, might be this is belonging to your today's presentation, this question. Although I want to ask you this one. So as you were talking about some toroid formation and all in your one of the videos. So my question is, many of the researchers have reported this toroid formation by external agencies like electric field, magnetic field, or other, external factors. So are there any way where we can passively form those toroids, like, I mean, any chemical trigger or something like that? Because there are very less literatures. And recently, I mean, maybe one of the professors from IIT Guwahati, Dipankar Bandyopadhyay's group, they have reported in 2020 in JCIS that they have chemical, with the help of chemical trigger, they have really generated those toroids. And even they have reported something like low to high Reynolds numbers, how that toroid formation is taking place. So what your take is on this? I mean, in the regard of this toroid formation with these external factors like agencies like fields, electric fields or other fields, and in contrast with that, this chemical triggers.
Okay, actually, I don't know the publications, but I would be interested in it. So if you can send me or the link or something like that, I would be interested in that. I cannot really answer this question. Initially, when we did not know the mechanism, we were also thinking of electric fields or what happens if the particles are charged. But it did not turn out, nothing turned out of it. And I would think that if the particles, for instance, are charged or electrostatic, they would be charged alike. And then I would expect more or less a repulsion of the particles. But the organization of particles due to external force fields, I don't know. It could be, perhaps it's possible, but I don't know this phenomenon. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. Thanks.